Good morning, everyone. I want, on behalf of the Foundation for Human Rights in Cuba, to welcome all of you and thank you for joining us today. The presentation of Infinite War is the result of a lengthy and very fruitful effort of investigation, research, and basically fellowship, academic fellowship, that have resulted in this product that we can now proudly share with you. First and foremost, I want to thank FHRC board, its chairman, Tony Costa, because without them, this wouldn't have been possible. It has been a learning process, I have to say this. It's been fascinating to see how this new concept, this new model of warfare has evolved, how sophisticated, how capable, how integrated this model has become. And in order to share the details of this, and without further ado, I want my dear friend and colleague, Juan Antonio Blanco, and also David Spencer, to join me on this in order to perform the presentation. First, we are going to go with Juan Antonio, so you will have an introduction to this new concept, Infinite War.
Well, thank you, Hugo, for helping us as a foundation to bring this into our attention. I don't know if you mentioned that you are the Director of Research at the Foundation for Human Rights in Cuba. And it has been really magnificent for us to have your contribution and cooperation to bring into light these different aspects of the new reality that we're facing in the 21st century. First of all, I would like to express why is that the Foundation, a human rights institution, is engaged in what apparently would be research on geopolitical and international security issues. And that is basically because we are, after the facts that we have found, we are now totally persuaded that the unholy criminal alliance between the regimes of Cuba and Venezuela gave birth to a new type of state, a criminal international enterprise, which it's called in international jargon a mafia state, and that is exactly the nature of those regimes that are now at the root of every possible violation of human rights in both countries and in the region, because they are expanding the instability and the lack of regional security to different countries in the region that they target to create a crisis of governance. So having said that, I would like to say what is coming out in the international bibliography that is now, quite considerable. What is the definition of a mafia state? And a mafia state is a place, most of the time it happens in post-communist countries, where an elite or a group of elites hijack the state institutions and make them work for their own exclusive benefit. They don't care anymore about meeting basic human needs of a population, much less the welfare of a population. They don't care about development as a country. They just care about entering the new Wild West economy of the illegal activities that now are counted in the billions of dollars. The global international crime economy could be compared to any economy of any developed country. And that's bringing billions of dollars in profits, not to the countries where these elites have seized the state institutions, but to their pockets. We see that in Cuba, when they evaporate virtually in a black hole the money that they gain outside with the doctors' brigade, for example, and in many other operations in which they money laundry, they provide services for money laundering of to other international allies like the FARC of Colombia, the ELN, Iran, and even the Russian mafia. So having said that, I believe that what is, a duty not only of specialists and experts like David, like you, in the area of regional security, to bring to the attention of the public, is that we are facing here a new type of regimes. This is not the classical totalitarian regime. This is not the classical communist regime, although they retain many of the features of those previous societies. They are basically have basically mutated. Their genes have mutated into a new type of a species, which is a criminal international organization. And this new type of state is also creating an international alliance that is not based, as during the years of the Cold War, along ideological lines. This new type of confrontation is brought about because these mafias are trying to ensure business partners and to ensure places where they can cultivate coca or poppies, where they can establish their labs, where they can have logistical access to key communications such as ports, main rivers, and so on and so forth. So, who are the enemies of this group of new states? The enemies are not necessarily the capitalist countries. The enemies are basically those countries that oppose their illegal and criminal activities, that actively and proactively create barriers to their international routes for drug trafficking, human trafficking, smuggling of weapons, and other international crimes that they commit, and that they need a free, open border to have access to their markets without any type of interference. So it's not an ideological uh, construct. It's not that they are socialists or communists and they declare war against all capitalist or imperialist countries. They declare war to anybody who opposes their criminal activities, who create barriers to their criminal activities. I am at this point not going to enter the type of new war that they wage. I think that David is more capacitated than me to provide that type of information. I am only going to say that to prevent these criminal mafias to get their way, we need governments to, first of all, gain awareness of what is the new enemy in the international scene, gain awareness that the old Westphalian model of international relations cannot apply to these criminal mafias, that the same way that the FBI in the United States and law enforcement agencies in the United States could not put an end to the major kingdom of the mafia in America some years ago. That changed when the RICO law came into effect because they needed a change in the paradigm to approach, in the legal paradigm to approach that new reality. And we need a change in the paradigm of international relations to be able to efficiently face this new danger. And one very important and relevant issue is that this is not about states or governments that may eventually one day declare war on Colombia or Ecuador or Bolivia or the United States. They are at war already with us. And they use their new approach to warfare that stops short from military confrontation, because in military confrontation they're aware that they will be outgunned, and they go through a more complex system of hybrid threats to exploit weaknesses in governance in our countries and to bring about instability and basically bringing down governments wherever those governments have tried to oppose their activities. So I want to leave it over there and give a chance to David to take the baton.
Absolutely. Thank you, Juan Antonio. David, I think that the core of this concept, as Juan Antonio has already laid out the basic aspects of this new model, need an approach from your professional background. So if you could please share with us your approach, you are going to have 10 minutes to develop it.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I disagree slightly with Juan Antonio in the sense that I do think that the background for this, I think that the foundation for this new form of warfare actually is ideological. The application is not ideological, and I think that's an important distinction to make. There is actually a long pedigree of ideological ideas that have come to fruition in this new model of conflict. And I want to talk a little bit about those ideological underpinnings, because I think they're important to understand the logic of why these people are doing what they're doing. And it really goes back to Mao, and people go, wait a minute, Mao, why are we talking about Mao? That's about insurgency. And I was thinking about that this morning. Actually, people misread Mao. We read the wrong book on guerrilla warfare, which is a tactical text, when we should be reading other texts. And what Mao really does is Mao asks himself the question of how a weaker force can fight and win against a stronger force. And he comes up with 5 or 6 principles that he then applies to the situation in China in 1937, 1938, and the answer is guerrilla warfare. And we tend to look at the answer and not the mental exercise that he goes through to come to that conclusion. And the mental exercise is actually far more important. The principles that he comes up with are far more important than the outcome, which is guerrilla warfare. And I want to talk about what these are, and then talk a little bit about and focus on a couple of them. The first principle he comes up with is protracted war, protracted struggle. And one of the things that you have to understand is that if you live in one of these states, you're constantly in a struggle, right? And protracted struggle basically just means that you fight or you struggle as long as it takes to win, and that you never give up, no matter how many times you're defeated. And then he comes up with this idea of relative correlation of forces, operational flexibility, mass mobilization, political military struggle, and then what he calls the 3 currents or audiences. And then finally, a guy named Trong Chin talks about an idea. He comes after Mao, but he synthesizes Mao in this idea of what he calls the combination of all forms of struggle. I want to emphasize two. I emphasize the relative correlation of forces, and I want to emphasize also the combination of all forms of struggle. The relative correlation of forces basically means that when in any struggle that you have with an enemy, there are always relative strengths and relative weaknesses. And so you try to use your relative strengths against the relative weaknesses of the other. And of course that's logical, but what it means is that if you, for example, if you're weak militarily, you're not going to attack, the enemy in a direct military manner. You're going to find some indirect way to do it. Or if you're weak in some other area, you don't dash yourself against the strength of the opposition. And so the idea that came up is that basically we use the form of struggle that gets us closest to our objective without putting the organization at risk of a strategic defeat. And what that translates into, at least in the application, is that while if the enemy is strong and his force is concentrated and regular, right? The more concentrated and regular and strong he is, the more dispersed, irregular, and indirect the form of struggle that I'm going to adopt, right? And vice versa. As the enemy becomes more irregular and more dispersed, I'm going to become more regular and more concentrated. Mao generally thought in military terms, and so he talked about guerrilla warfare and mobile warfare and the war of positions. But he also mentions, but he doesn't really go into it that much, that you could apply this to non-military means, right? And this is what Trong Chinh does. Trong Chinh is a Vietnamese acolyte of Mao. He goes to China. He studies the Chinese Revolution. In fact, his name is not a name at all. It is a nickname that means the Long March, in honor of Mao's Long March. And his idea, what he came up with, is that all forms of struggle occur simultaneously and none are discarded, right? The form that predominates in time and space depends on the relative correlation of forces of the moment. And so the revolutionary art or the struggle art is to understand what the correlation of forces is and to design your combination of forms of struggle to take maximum advantage of that moment, right? Now, one of the problems is that people became in love with the armed struggle, and they began to apply the armed struggle regardless of what the actual situation was. I mean, this was the huge criticism of the FARC, that long after things had changed, FARC continued to use guerrilla warfare to try to take power when the correlation of forces had changed. And that's exactly what the thesis of this book is, that the correlation of forces has changed, and therefore our enemies, which come from this ideological background, even if they're not ideological themselves, they have the theoretical training or the theoretical education. They understand that this correlation of forces has changed, right? The Cold War ended. Military intervention in politics became, no longer politically correct. Democracy was widely accepted across all countries, almost all countries. There was agreement about the protection of vulnerable groups. Legal systems became very much focused on guaranteeing individual rights. There's no monopoly of information. In the West, we perfected counterinsurgency, and our military technology advances made it very difficult, particularly precision weapons, made it very difficult for even irregular military forces to survive very long against Western countries. And so new methods had to be adopted. One of the most seminal works in this area is this idea of unrestricted war that was developed by two Chinese colonels, and I'm going to slaughter the pronunciations of their names, Wang Xiangsu and Qiao Liang. I'm sure the Chinese would be rolling in their graves hearing me understand this. And basically what they did is they took the ideas of Mao and they modernized them. They made them current with modern day the modern day situation. And again, they were focused on how does China, a relatively weak country, defeat a country like the United States. And they came up with several rules, and you can actually read the book online. But I'm going to synthesize a very long book in just a few what I call rules or principles. And the first one is that there are no rules. Nothing is prohibited. The second is that the military effort is no longer predominant. It's just another tool in your toolbox of things that you can do to struggle with your enemy. Wars begin far before there are any shots fired, if shots are even fired at all. You can cause great damage to the enemy with cyber attacks, artificial economic crises, subtle biological attacks, etc. You can combine things at any level possible, at the national, the international, with non-state actors. Civil society is part of the war, even if they don't know that they're part of the war, or even if they don't want to be part of the war. And finally, a country can be at war with another country without the latter knowing that it's happening. And this is what Juan Antonio, just said. And so we shouldn't be surprised that the methods of struggle that we see today are not what we're anticipating. Ugo and I have done work on Odebrecht, and how Odebrecht has been used as a form to help, anti-Western political causes prosper and gain power. We're looking at the social protests all across the Americas and all across the world. We're looking at how, illicit markets have developed this huge role. Juan Antonio talked about illicit economies, the narco economy. Mao said, political power comes from the barrel of a gun. I would say that the theme today would be that political power comes from the illegal or the illicit dollar or the illicit money. Anyway, there's all kinds of different ways. And I'm going to end my comments here because I think I've exceeded my 10 minutes. And I know that Ugo will continue with these ideas. Thank you.
Well, absolutely. Thank you, David. Just to wrap up this concept, and before we go into the conclusions, if you have any question, please feel free to post them. Our PR director, Ms. Melissa Sheffield, would share those questions with the panelists, and we will do our best to answer them. Going to the points that my colleagues have posted. First, we are at war. As a society, we are at war. We are at war with an enemy that is well organized, relentless, and that has very clear goals. Second, a lot of the language that has been used, it's eerily similar to the world of corporations. That is not a coincidence. That is by design. So some people would wonder why there is no evident structure of command and control. There is not a formal structure, but there is a fluid form of command and control, extremely opportunistic. So you can have Brazilian gangs coordinating operations with Mexican cartels, helped by state agents, Iranian, Russians, Chinese, supported by formal governments that have taken full control of Westphalian states. Third, this goes full circle. We talk about ideology. Ideology might not be the goal, but it is a tool. When you read Lenin, you are going to read something that is basic for this entire concept. Every single thing that forwards and promotes the cause of the revolution, it is morally justified. That maxim has been perfected. Every single thing that allows the perpetuation of the illicit cycle and permits these organizations to prosper and blossom, it's going to be justified. Fourth, you need to understand that Guo Liang and Wang Shensui, I'm certain I'm not doing better than David in the proper pronunciation, are very clear on this. The illicit side of societies is something that the West have reduced to the law enforcement field. This is not acceptable for this new model. And it has its origin in a seminal work that was performed by the KGB and the GRU, the two most important Soviet intelligence agencies. When asked by the Soviet Politburo how to defeat the US, the answer that they received was not of their liking. The answer was, there is no scenario in which we can conventionally defeat the United States. Then another question was posed. What could we do in order to achieve success confronting the might of the United States economically, socially, militarily? And the answer was, the only thing that can compare to the capabilities of the United States as a nation, as an organized society, is the cycle of illicit trade. And they made a decision in order to use that as a weapon. The only thing is that here comes ideology again. They thought they could use that so they could prevail, and then they would deal with the illicit cycle. So they would return to their concept of an organized society. This new model ignores that. It thrives in chaos. It thrives in performing illicit activity. They have forgotten the idea of creating the paradise for peasants and workers. Their main goal is to gain profit, because money, as Juan Antonio and David have very precisely described, is the power behind all these movements. Finally, you need to realize that this interaction allows these enemies to be extremely efficient and nimble. If you need criminal organizations in Santiago or the street of Minneapolis to provide the muscle to create instability, to challenge governance, to make governments weak, while at the same time cyber criminals from criminal organizations, but that interact with foreign intelligence services like Cozy Bear and other groups, weaken the formal system of response and the ability to answer efficiently the challenges posed by the quote unquote social mobilization. You got it. You're going to have that ability. So we are in front and facing a new kind of enemy, a hybrid model that's capable of social mobilization, political activity, and illicit trade in every shape, way, and form. If we are not willing to learn and accept this reality, we are going to be fighting this war with the weapons and concepts of the previous one, and sadly, we will be facing defeat sooner than later.
Thank you.
So,
our first question is how, excuse me, how do you recommend that we interact differently with this new hybrid model?
I think that the best option to do that is to allow first David and then Juan Antonio to address that question.
So one of the things that we've been looking at is that, essentially what they're doing is they have recognized that the United States and the West have developed this military superiority. And so they have moved to this other form of struggle, which is through this combination of criminality and social mobilization. And this becomes a very difficult problem because as we look at our tools that we have in these areas, the justice system, our police, our tradition of jurisprudence, they're aimed at individuals. They're aimed at, our justice system is aimed at making cases at the individual level. They're not aimed at thinking about strategic problems because, we have not anticipated that these things would get to this level. And so one of the difficulties that we have had is to talk to people at top levels of government to convince them that these criminal activities are actually at a strategic level. Now, so the first task is we need to start thinking. We need to get our justice system and our police investigations and other things to think more strategically. Not leaving aside, our, individual cases and criminality, but to start looking at these things at the strategic level. The problem then comes, then you're criminalizing everybody. You're criminalizing, for example, you're criminalizing all the people that are out protesting. Well, that's unconstitutional, right? To criminalize everybody that's out protesting because protesting is a right that is guaranteed by our Constitution with the First Amendment of freedom of speech. So how do you do it? Well, you have to think strategically, but you have to apply individually. And precisely one of the reasons that this is so difficult to combat is that you have all kinds of people mixed together. You have some people that are there to overthrow the system. You have other people that are out there that are just upset about something that happened and are willing to use a little violence to express their discontent. So it's a legitimate cause, but maybe illegitimate activity. And then you have other people that are just out there, exercising their First Amendment right to freedom of speech. And so you really do have to apply the law individually, even if you think at the strategic level, right? And so that's the first step. Now, I don't know everything that has to be done, but our enemies talk about a combination of all forms of struggle. We need to think in terms of a combination of all forms of struggle to solve the problem. So the problem is not just military or not just legal. It's also economic, it's social, it's informational, it's, every single level needs to be applied against the strategy that's being applied against us. And like them, we need to find the ways to maximize our strengths and minimize our weaknesses. That's where I would start.
Juan Antonio?
Well, first I'd like to subscribe everything that David have said, and just perhaps stress again, everybody, and when I say everybody, I mean not only governments, I mean civil society. Citizens have to become aware of what is going on here. They have to gain conscience about what is going on here. We are pioneering here, in a certain way, this conversation on this topic. And this needs to go around and to also, be engaged, this conversation in other, in universities, in other institutions of civil society. One thing, to put an example to what David very well characterized in general theoretical terms, look at what happened in Chile. How did the demonstrations in Chile started, and how did the violence within the demonstration started? Well, though somebody had the idea in the government or in the subway system to raise the price of the ticket of the subway. And obviously that affects everybody that uses that public transportation system. Everybody was upset. There was a critical mass of people ready to go out and protest in one way or the other. Now, what was totally unusual, what is totally unexplainable, is that almost 24, 48 hours after the raise of the price of a ticket, 16 metro stations were burned to the ground in a military synchronized operation using the same incendiary device. And that is simply not possible to be improvised in 24 hours. For doing something like that, you need sleeping cells for a long time that have been trained in the use, for example, of that incendiary device. You need to produce the incendiary device. You need to create silos where those incendiary devices can be safely stored. You need to study the camera security system of the metros. You need to study the times where they are more vulnerable to an attack like this. And you need somebody to coordinate in time what was going to be a synchronized simultaneous attack to all the 16 metro stations. That is not something that characterizes a normal, spontaneous protest of an angry citizen that doesn't want to pay more for the metro. That is an organization that is on the ground, that has been trained, that were sleeping cells, that can be activated at any moment, and that are very efficient in embedding themselves into what otherwise is a legitimate protest to create havoc and to create ingovernability and to create, an spiral of an escalation of violence in which you are provoking the forces of order to shoot back, to use some sort of force, and then you can focus the attention of the media on the victims of those that were in one way or another unfortunately hit by a stray bullet of the forces of the police or something like that. And that is exactly what you're looking for. In Bolivia, the FARC, the Colombian FARC, displaced snipers and embedded the snipers in the middle of the demonstrations that were taking place when Morales lost the election. And the forces of Morales were trying to make sure that Morales would remain in power, and the forces that claimed that the election was a fraud was trying to, make sure that there will be some transition government. Well, what were these snipers doing? They were not shooting at the enemies of Morales. They were shooting at both the enemies of Morales and Morales sympathizers. Why were they doing so? Because they wanted to provoke an escalation in a civil war in Bolivia. And they wanted to provoke the forces of order to use force against any demonstration, any demonstrator, and then use that in the media to exploit it. That's the way that they operate. And that is what, David was very appropriately underlining. One thing is that you defend the First Amendment. Another very different is that you take advantage of the First Amendment to promote, violence and destruction, which is absolutely not called for.
Melissa?
We have two more questions. The next question is, what are the countries where you believe this is most prevalent?
Well, let me begin with answering or trying to answer that question. In terms of presence, you need to be very precise. There are countries that are deploying this new method of warfare. Among them, Russia, Cuba, China, Iran, and there are those that are being targeted by this new model of warfare. The first and most important one, the United States of America. But Juan Antonio and David have mentioned some other countries. There is a very, very evident example in Colombia. Chile was another one. Bolivia has been another one. Mark Galeotti, for example, when we are talking about Russia, talks about this, talks about the fact on how you use this even for targeted assassination in order to have plausible deniability. Instead of using formal state actors, you use Chechen mafia. You eliminate people like Boris Nemtsov, or you perform the assassination attempt against Sergei Skripal, or lately to Navalny. And you can have plausible deniability. So Putin can, with a straight face, tell people like Angela Merkel or Emmanuel Macron that Russian security forces didn't participate at all in such operations. And that is partially true. The problem is that they funded and they interacted with this interlocking structure with other actors, non-state actors that are allies to these countries. Cuba is probably the ultimate example. Cuba is able, through its diplomatic outposts, to coordinate very complex operations, not only in terms of human trafficking or money laundering. It can facilitate operations as complex as drug trafficking, starting in Bolivia, going through Brazil, entering seaport terminals in countries like Mozambique or Angola, and from there, the world's the limit. Let's call it product, for use, again, a corporate term for cocaine. The product is going to reach countries as far apart as Jordan, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, or even the United States. And then again, the goal is to generate the logistical abilities through the funding obtained through these activities to promote their strategic goals. So I would now, let my colleagues to jump in, because I think this is a very, very interesting approach. So gentlemen, what do you think about the countries where this model is present?
Well, it's very interesting to me. I don't want, I just want to add something really quick. It's very interesting to me that wherever you find Russian organized crime, the head is always a retired colonel, a quote unquote retired colonel of either the KGB or the, one of the armed forces, which asks the question, it's kind of like the CIA, someone's retired from the CIA. Are they really retired from the CIA? That's my question. And the other thing that's very interesting is that Russian organized crime tends to grow wherever the Russian government establishes a robust presence, because it ends up being a tool of the Russians, one more tool in the combination of all forms of struggle. There is no difference. They don't really distinguish between legal and illegal. You know, it's just they have one more tool which they can use, and it's a form of pressure and another thing. Juan Antonio, I don't know if you have additional comments.
Oh, in terms of examples, we have seen a lot of that in the last year in Latin America. For example, the way that they handle, I mean, when I say they, I mean Cuba, Venezuela, how they handle an opportunity in Ecuador to try to create chaos in Ecuador against the current president. It's very interesting that they follow the same pattern that they followed years ago with the M19 in Colombia, when they assault the Palace of Justice in Colombia. The true goal of that operation, where Cuba was the intermediary between Escobar and the M19, so that the M19 will get the weapons to make the operation from Escobar, from Pablo Escobar, was basically to go to the files of those that were going to be extradited to the United States and burn them. That was the deal. I mean, you make a big splash with a political operation for the M19. It's a win-win, but it's also a win-win if you get in there and you go to the files and you burn all the files of our people that are going to be extradited to the United States, so that they would have to start all over the judicial process to make this extradition possible. They, interestingly enough, in Ecuador, they follow the same pattern. They try to burn the building of Contraloría de la República, where the files against Correa and all the cronies of Correa were deposited. So it would have been, you know, very interesting how they would have handled the whole thing later and say, well, you know, the files are gone, now you have to start all over again if you want to go through the legal process. Otherwise, you are totally, you know, arbitrary in the way that you're treating us, and so on and so forth. So those are operations. The previous one, perhaps I didn't express, you know, with total accuracy, but, you know, I think that Hugo expressed it exactly how I wanted to convey it. Ideology is not any longer the goal, is the tool to get the goal, in my opinion. I don't know if David would agree with that way of putting it. And the same way that ideology was a goal when the M19 assaulted the Palace of Justice, but in combination already with the mafia, the Colombian mafia, it was not any longer the goal of these, you know, of Cuba, Venezuela, and the people were aiding and abetting their actions in Ecuador when they tried to burn the files of these people. I mean, the cloak that they use to legitimize all these actions in Latin America is, of course, ideology. They claim that they are fighting imperialism, that they are fighting capitalism, and so on and so forth. But at this point, neither Putin nor Raúl Castro, not the other people are very much into communism or whatever. They're into their businesses. And what they use as a tool to achieve their goals is borrowing from Mao and from other thinkers with which they have, of course, a lot of experience, some of the ideas and the methods of prolonged war and using different types of tools to bring down governments, but at the same time, the final objective that these elites, I'm not saying the big masses that may be attracted to those movements, but that the elite that's controlling actually these processes is not guided by ideology, it's guided by their own businesses. That's basically what I wanted to convey before. Thank you.
What I would add to that just really quickly is what the ideology does is it gives you A, justification, B, a framework, and C, a methodology.
Right.
And
Right.
and what they've done is they've abandoned every other aspect of the ideology. So it's a very pragmatic and very, you know, very rational way of approaching how I'm going to obtain my purpose, which is about power and about wealth.
Right.
Melissa?
Okay, so the last question we kind of already touched on, but it's when you refer to all forms of struggle and then you say ideology is the tool to get the goal and not the goal, what does that mean? And is that part of a larger style of government?
Well, just to add something, because I think that David has already made a very, very precise definition, is this. Take as an example Antifa, okay, which is this kind of boogeyman that everybody talks about that nobody understands. The basic principle should be anti-fascism. So they are allegedly against fascism. It's kind of an irony, but because when you see the tactics that they are deploying, they are very reminiscent of what fascism used to employ in its day. But let's analyze that for a second. They like to be self-defined as anti-fascists and anarchists. When you read Proudhon, who is probably rolling in its grave every single time they self-define as anarchists, you're going to see that this has nothing to do with anarchism, okay? Anarchism was basically deemed so dangerous by the communists that Lenin himself said that he deemed that as a bigger danger for the revolution than all the capitalist countries together. Okay, that's why they devoted so much effort to destroy it. Take the example of the Spanish Civil War. That's just, as Juan Antonio defined, a convenient cloak, a way to justify that. So basically what we're seeing here is a pragmatic approach to every single thing that can give me the opportunity to be successful in promoting my strategic interest, and I don't care if that is going to be the actual and final outcome. David, please.
Yeah, so you know, when socialism was you know, back at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, when they were conceiving of how to come into power, right? The important thing is not so much their ideology in the sense of what their utopia was that they were looking for. What's important is that they had a series of discussions of how they were going to get into power, right? And so they developed this very pragmatic methodology to achieve power. And that was not just from discussions, it was also from trial and error. And what you see is, you know, non-socialist or, you know, all kinds of different groups that have the same problem. So radical Islam would like to take power in the Middle East. Well, instead of reinventing the wheel, what radical Islam has done is they have read Mao and they have read Che Guevara and they've read all these guys, and they said, look, these guys have developed methodology. And this methodology, why start from zero even though these guys don't believe the same things we do? They've developed the method to achieve power. And that method includes this idea of the combination of all forms of struggle. So any ideology could apply that methodology to either take or keep power. And that's my point. It's that within the framework of this ideology, they had these very pragmatic discussions on what to do. And it's the what to do that's important, not so much the ideology itself. That's the point that we've been trying to make. The ideology has been essentially discarded, but the methodology has not. And so this idea of the combination of all forms of struggle, that's what's going on. And it allows you, and one of the things that's great about this idea is it allows you to be as flexible as you want, right? You know, if this path doesn't work, well, there's another form of struggle that might get you closer to your goal. So that's what's going to predominate. and it can be different in different time periods. So in some areas, the military struggle will lead because that's the thing that gets you closest to power. In other places, that's not going to work. And so, for example, in the Americas, all across the Americas, to include the United States, you don't see military action predominating. It doesn't go away. I mean, there's still the ELN in Colombia. There's violent actions in almost all of these countries, but it's not the main method that they're using. What they're using is mobilizing people for violent social protest, you know, and then framing it in this idea of, you know, social injustice or, you know, or being violent for a socially righteous cause. And anyway, but it can take multiple forms depending on where you are and depending on what the correlation of forces is. So you do an analysis of the correlation of forces. You say, here's my strength, here's my weakness. Okay, I'm going to attack with my strength. And it can have multiple expressions depending on time and space and context. And I hope that's not too that's not too what do you call it? I didn't say that in such a complex way that it's not unable to understand. It's actually very, very pragmatic and very rational. But the Marxists were the ones that developed it. Anybody can apply it.
Juan Antonio?
Basically, I don't think I have anything more to say than what David have just said and you have said before. This is a question also that we addressed with the previous one. And again, if we are about to close, I think that the only thing that I would wish as director of the foundation is that other institutions of human rights follow our example and engage in this conversation. Because, you know, it is interesting that given the use that the phrase was given, the phrase of regime change during the Iraq war, it has become like a bad word, like something that we should not refer to. Well, the thing is that we are dealing with regimes that need to be changed if we are working on human rights, because if we change the governments, but we don't change the regime of governance in these countries, in this case, these mafia type of regimes, we are not going to solve the problem of security nor the problem of human rights. So that is why every time more we have to take a closer look at the way that these regimes operate and what is their true nature.
Absolutely. And just to close this presentation and for everybody to remember, the main reason to do this is because, and we discussed this with Juan Antonio and also with David, is that when you see the most blatant and serious human rights violations in recent history, those have been perpetrated by actors of this hybrid new model. Take as an example, David just said that ISIS, they are behind the largest humanitarian crisis that humanity has faced in recent history. And they were using this model. They keep using it. Take Cubazuela, this joint entity between Cuba and Venezuela. They are responsible for the second largest human rights crisis in the world. It's been reflected by a very recent UN report. So that's why it's relevant. That's why, by the way, here in the foundation, we are in the process of producing a follow-up book that we are hoping we will be able to present soon. But those are the reasons. This is why this is relevant, and this is why all of you should care about this. Without anything else to say, I want to thank everybody, our magnificent team, our PR director, Melissa Sheffield, and again to the board of AFHRC for this opportunity. And of course, to my friends and colleagues in this panel, thank you very much.